Right now, as you watch this, nearly 300 hectares of the most expensive coastal real estate in Canada is physically detaching from the North American continent and sliding into the Pacific Ocean. This is not a theoretical model for the year 2050. This is the reality on the ground in Sentinel Bay, British Columbia, just 40 kilometers north of Vancouver, where the Earth is moving 80 times faster than it did just 3 years ago. According to the latest interferometric synthetic aperture radar data from the Canadian Space Agency's RadarSat constellation mission, the land is displacing at a rate of up to 10 centimeters every single week. To put that in perspective, the ground beneath these multi-million-dollar homes is migrating toward the shoreline faster than the growth of a human fingernail in real time. What scientists saw in the last month's data changes everything we thought we knew about coastal stability in the Pacific Northwest. This is no longer a slow-motion geological process. It is a catastrophic acceleration occurring in the present tense. The scale of the failure is staggering. A landslide complex that was mapped at 120 hectares in early 2022 has now metastasized, swallowing more than 280 hectares, doubling in size and showing no signs of stabilization. The impact on infrastructure is surgical and devastating. 135 luxury residences have been without natural gas for 21 months, as FortisBC crews watch their pipelines buckle like drinking straws. Another 245 homes lost electricity after BC Hydro technicians were forced to de-energize the grid with just 24 hours notice, citing a total system compromise that threatened to ignite the surrounding forest. The Premier of British Columbia has declared a provincial state of emergency, but the $65 million already spent by the district of Sentinel Bay to stabilize the slope has been described by geologists as throwing gravel into an abyss. But there is a detail in the geotechnical reports that the public has yet to fully grasp: a bureaucratic failure as deep as the tectonic rift itself. When the municipality petitioned Public Safety Canada for $38 million in Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangements (DFAA) funding, the federal government denied the claim, not once but twice. Their reasoning: the landslide is classified as a pre-existing condition. Ottawa looked at 280 hectares of collapsing coastline, at families living in the dark using propane camp stoves in $4 million living rooms, at roads that have been twisted into impossible corkscrews, and concluded that because the ground was already unstable, this is not a sudden disaster, it is a predictable outcome. And in Canada, standard homeowners insurance does not cover earth movement. There is no coverage for landslides, no policy for subsidence, and no safety net for erosion. The residents of Sentinel Bay are trapped in a geological and financial pincer. Their equity is vanishing into the sea, and the only exit is a provincial buyout offering 75 cents on the dollar for what their homes were worth before the world began to move. The clock is not just ticking, it is echoing off the cliffside. To understand the physics of this collapse, you have to look beneath the surface of the Howe Sound region, down past the luxury basements and the manicured gardens. The Sentinel Bay Peninsula is not solid ground. It is an ancient, dormant megaslide. Roughly 30 meters below the topsoil lies a catastrophic geological flaw, a prehistoric layer of bentonite clay that tilts at a precarious angle toward the Strait of Georgia. For 250,000 years, the weight of the peninsula has been resting on this sleek, unstable failure plane. It is a classic weak layer system, a tectonic trap that has been waiting for a trigger. In the mid-1950s, human engineering provided it. In 1954, British Columbia's Department of Highways extended a major arterial road across the crown of the slope to facilitate development. The construction added thousands of tons of overburden and, more importantly, severed the natural drainage channels that kept the deep clay dry. The reaction was delayed but violent. At 8:14 a.m. on September 12, 1956, residents of the then sparse settlement reported a groaning sound from the earth. By noon, 140 homes were splintering. The ground didn't just crack, it flowed. The resulting legal battle saw the province pay out millions, but as the decades passed, the collective memory of the 1956 event faded. By the early 2000s, the Sentinel Bend was once again the most coveted address in the province. Hundreds of new luxury estates were built directly atop the same failure plain. These modern homes brought with them heavy swimming pools, extensive irrigation systems, and septic drainage, all pumping millions of liters of water directly into the subsurface. In 1999, the warning signs returned. During the construction of a high-profile coastal golf course, the entire 18th hole, along with several hectares of fairway, simply detached and fell 50 meters into the Pacific. The developer went into receivership. A Canadian real estate conglomerate eventually bought the remains for a fraction of the cost and rebuilt it as the Sentinel National Golf Club. Today, the 17th green sits less than 600 meters from the current active rupture zone. The true acceleration began with the atmospheric river events of early 2023 and the record-breaking deluge of 2024. This was not a standard storm surge, it was a hydrological assault. Sensors managed by Natural Resources Canada, NRCan, recorded rainfall totals exceeding 300% of seasonal norms. This water did not simply run off into the sea. It percolated through the porous volcanic rock, saturated the sediment, and reached the 250,000-year-old clay layer 30 meters down. The water acted as a high-pressure lubricant. The friction holding the peninsula in place vanished. At 4:42 p.m. on January 15, 2026, GNSS monitoring stations located near the Sentinel Bay Pier recorded a 15-centimeter horizontal offset in a single 4-hour window. The Greater Sentinel Bend Landslide Complex was born. Dr. Aris Thorne, a senior geophysicist with the Geological Survey of Canada, stated in a recent technical briefing, "The pore water pressure at the failure interface has reached a critical threshold. We are no longer seeing incremental creep. We are seeing a massive, gravity-driven block failure that covers two of the municipality's 36 square kilometers. The land is no longer tethered to the bedrock. The data is harrowing. High-precision seismographs have detected ground chatter, thousands of microfractures occurring every hour as the Earth tears itself apart. This is a coupled system failure. The weight of the residential infrastructure, the destabilized clay, and the lubrication of extreme climate events have converged into a singular geological inevitability." By July 2024, the situation reached a breaking point. Fortis BC technicians monitoring real-time strain gauges on the primary gas mains saw the lines stretching beyond their 5% tolerance. On July 29th at 9 p.m., the order was given to vent and seal the lines for 135 homes. The risk of a massive methane explosion triggered by a shearing pipe was too high. Weeks later, BC Hydro followed suit. Their tension relief strategy, an experimental attempt to use flexible, modular power poles, could not keep up with a ground that was moving 40 centimeters a month. On August 24, 2025, a final notice was taped to the doors of 245 homes. Residents were given exactly 24 hours to evacuate or face life without light, heat, or water. For families who had invested their life savings into these coastal sanctuaries, the clock hit zero in a single day. The infrastructure, designed for a static world, has been defeated by a landscape that has regained its fluid state. To grasp the sheer scale of the inevitable, we have to look at the dark ancestry of the Canadian landscape. Geologically speaking, the Sentinel Bay disaster is not a freak accident. It is the latest chapter in a 10,000-year-old cycle of post-glacial failure. As the Cordilleran ice sheet retreated from the British Columbia coast, it left behind thick deposits of glacial marine clay, sediment that was compressed under the weight of kilometers of ice. This is the ladder clay equivalent of the West, a substance that remains stable until its salinity is leached out by fresh water or until its pore water pressure is spiked by extreme saturation. When that happens, the ground doesn't just slide, it undergoes a process called liquefaction. It turns from a solid to a viscous fluid in seconds. We have seen this before in the Canadian record, most hauntingly in 1971 at Saint-Jean-Vianney, Quebec. There the earth suddenly liquefied, swallowing 40 homes and killing 31 people in a matter of minutes. The ground was classified as a pre-existing condition then too, an ancient seabed that simply decided it was time to move. The Sentinel Bay complex is operating on the same lethal physics. Natural Resources Canada has categorized the region as a high-risk geohazard zone for decades, yet the development of the Gold Coast continued unabated. This is the great Canadian tectonic paradox. We build our most expensive infrastructure on our least stable land. According to the Geological Survey of Canada, the Sentinel Bay slide is currently displacing enough earth every month to fill BC Place Stadium 3 times over. And the Greater Sentinel Band is just the tip of the spear. Historical parallels suggest that when these massive coastal blocks fail, they don't do so in isolation. In 1965, the Hope Slide, the largest recorded landslide in Canadian history, displaced 47 million cubic meters of rock and debris, obliterating a section of the Hope-Princeton Highway. While that was a rock avalanche, Sentinel Bay is a rotational slump, a slower but equally relentless predator that is systematically erasing the coastline. The data models from Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC, suggest a terrifying feedback loop. As the Pacific warms, atmospheric rivers, narrow corridors of concentrated moisture, are hitting the BC coast with 20% more intensity than they did in the 20th century. This isn't just rain. It is a hydraulic injection into the heart of the landslide. A 2025 study by the University of British Columbia's Department of Earth, Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences found that for every 10 centimeters of rainfall, the velocity of the Sentinel Bay slide increases by an average of 12%. But here is a statistical reality that no one is talking about at the provincial level. 72% of British Columbia's 25,000-kilometer coastline consists of actively eroding sea cliffs or unstable glacial tills. Sentinel Bay is not an outlier. It is a preview of the managed retreat crisis that is about to bankrupt coastal municipalities across the country. The numbers, when stacked, are staggering. Currently, an estimated $100 billion in Canadian coastal property is sitting in zones where the ground is physically incapable of supporting permanent structures over the next century. In the Maritimes, sections of the Chignecto Isthmus, the vital land bridge connecting Nova Scotia to the rest of Canada, are facing similar subsidence issues, where the ground is literally sinking as the sea rises. In the Arctic, permafrost thaw is causing entire communities to slump into the Beaufort Sea. But Sentinel Bay is the most acute symptom because of the sheer density of wells and infrastructure. Within just 30 years, a single extreme storm event, combined with the projected 30 centimeter sea level rise by 2050, could flood more than 150,000 Canadian residents and cause over $30 billion in direct real estate damage. And the insurance industry? It has already checked out. In 2024, the Insurance Bureau of Canada warned that uninsurable zones are expanding faster than mitigation efforts can keep up. The precedent set by Public Safety Canada's denial of DFAA funds for Sentinel Bay is a seismic shift in Canadian disaster policy. By labeling the slide a pre-existing condition, the federal government has effectively signaled that homeowners are on their own. If the ground was known to be unstable 100 years ago, any destruction today is your financial responsibility. It is a legal trap that leaves 500,000 Canadians living in the coastal erosion risk zone with zero federal backstop. We are watching the first multi-billion-dollar neighborhood in Canadian history simply disappear from the tax rolls. And the geology that decided this fate 250,000 years ago is only just beginning to accelerate. To the people living within the Sentinel Bay exclusion zone, the statistics are no longer abstract data points from a Natural Resources Canada server. They are the sounds of floorboards screaming under tension and the sight of the Pacific Ocean creeping closer to their bedroom windows every morning. This is the human face of a geological divorce. On August 24, 2025, the reality of the crisis shifted from a property value concern to a survival situation. Elena Rossi, a high school principal who has called the Sentinel Bend home for 28 years, recalls the moment the notice appeared on her front door. It wasn't a request. It was a 24-hour ultimatum from BC Hydro. The ground movement had reached such a velocity, over 30 centimeters a month, that the electrical distribution lines were physically being pulled out of their transformers. If they didn't cut the power, the entire neighborhood would become a massive electrical fire hazard. Elena had one day to pack 3 decades of life into a rented SUV. There were no moving trucks available. No company would risk sending a 5-ton vehicle onto a road that was actively buckling into half-meter deep fissures. The scene at the Sentinel Bay checkpoint was one of quiet, expensive desperation. Families were seen hauling propane tanks and gas generators into homes that were once featured in architectural magazines. For those who stayed, like retired marine engineer Anuj Deshmukh, life has reverted to a pre-industrial struggle. Anuj refused the provincial buyout. His home, a $4.5 million masterpiece of glass and cedar, is now perched on a series of massive hydraulic jacks and I-beams, a desperate engineering gambit known as riding the slide. Every morning, Anuj checks the digital levels mounted to his foundation. If the house tilts more than 1.5 degrees, he manually adjusts the jacks to compensate for the Earth's migration toward the sea. He cooks on a camping stove and showers at a community center in Squamish, 20 minutes away. The government tells us the land is a pre-existing condition, Anuj says, his voice echoing in a dark living room. But the mortgage isn't. The bank doesn't care if the ground is sliding. They want their $15,000 a month, whether the house is on the cliff or in the water. The logistical failure is a cascading nightmare. Telus and Rogers crews have abandoned attempts to repair the fiber optic cables that serve the peninsula. The constant shearing of the earth snaps the lines as fast as they can be spliced. The district of Sentinel Bay has already spent $64.4 million in a futile attempt to dewater the slope, installing massive vertical pumps to suck moisture out of the clay layer 30 meters down. But the pumps require power, and the power grid is gone. The city is now using diesel generators to keep the pumps running, burning $12,000 in fuel every day, just to slow a slide that the Geological Survey of Canada says cannot be stopped. The psychological toll on the first responders is equally immense. Captain Marcus Thorne of the Sentinel Bay Fire Department describes the phantom calls, sensors indicating a gas leak or a structural collapse that turn out to be the sound of the earth itself. You can hear the mountain moving, Thorne says. It's a low-frequency rumble, like a train that never arrives. We have to tell people we can't send a ladder truck into their driveway because the asphalt is too thin. We are watching a community be erased in real time, and we are powerless to catch it. The financial trap is perfectly engineered to leave these residents with nothing. The provincial voluntary buyout program, funded by a specific hazard mitigation grant from Public Safety Canada, is capped at $42 million. A drop in the bucket for a zone with billions in assets. It covers only 22 of the most high-risk properties. The offer is 75% of the assessed value from December 1, 2022, before the atmospheric rivers triggered the catastrophic acceleration. For a resident like Elena Rossi, whose home was appraised at $3.2 million, that is an immediate loss of $800,000 in equity. For many, that $800,000 represents their entire retirement savings. They are being offered a choice between a massive financial loss or staying in a home with no lights, no heat, and no guarantee that the floor will be there when they wake up. The ecological impact is the final, silent consequence. As the 280-hectare complex slides into the Strait of Georgia, it isn't just dirt entering the water. It is the debris of a century of development. Swimming pool chemicals, septic waste, lead paint, and household plastics are being ground into the marine environment. The sediment plumes are visible from the RadarSat satellites, extending kilometers into the Howe Sound, smothering critical glass sponge reefs that have existed for 9,000 years. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans has already issued a total harvest closure for the area. The land is not just leaving the residents, it is colonizing the ocean, destroying one ecosystem to make room for the wreckage of another. The clock in Sentinel Bay isn't just marking time, it's marking the disappearance of a world. As we move deeper into 2026, the question is no longer if Sentinel Bay will collapse, but how much of the surrounding coastline it will take with it. The rainy season in British Columbia typically tapers off in April or May, but the deep-seated hydrology of the peninsula operates on a lethal delay. The water that fell during the atmospheric rivers of 2024 is only now reaching the deepest sections of the Altamira failure plain. In a technical briefing released last week, municipal geologists confirmed that even a dry month has resulted in a 7.1% reacceleration of the movement. The ground is now pushing outward at a steady 4 centimeters per week. This persistent velocity suggests that the Greater Sentinel Band has transitioned from a sporadic landslide into a continuous gravity-driven conveyor belt. Right now, BC Hydro is attempting a feat of engineering that has no global precedent. They call it the tension relief strategy. Crews are installing modular, skid-mounted electrical substations and high-tension lines designed with enough slack to accommodate meters of ground displacement. It is a desperate experiment, an attempt to build a resilient grid on a foundation that is physically migrating. If the poles lean too far, the automated sensor strips the breakers, plunging entire blocks back into darkness. There is no guarantee it will work, and there is certainly no guarantee that the roads required to service this equipment will remain intact. The district of Sentinel Bay has already abandoned several primary arteries, as the cost of repaving a road that tears itself apart every 7 days has become a fiscal impossibility. But the Sentinel precedent is what should keep every coastal Canadian awake at night. By classifying this 280-hectare collapse as a pre-existing condition, Public Safety Canada has created a new doctrine for the era of climate catastrophe. If the Geological Survey of Canada has ever mapped your neighborhood as having unstable terrain or ancient landslide debris, maps that exist for nearly 60% of the habitable British Columbia coast, you are effectively living in a zone of zero federal liability. This isn't limited to the West Coast. In Ontario, the Scarborough Bluffs are retreating at an accelerating rate, threatening thousands of homes. In the St. Lawrence River Corridor, sensitive clays pose a silent threat to critical rail infrastructure and aging residential sectors. The federal government's refusal to provide disaster financial assistance for Sentinel Bay signals a pivot toward managed retreat by abandonment. They are not telling people to move, they are simply making it impossible for them to stay. The numbers for the next 30 years are staggering. A joint study by researchers at the University of Victoria and the GSC projects that sea level rise will double the erosion rate of Canada's Pacific sea cliffs by 2055. We are looking at 500,000 Canadians currently residing in active geohazard zones. Over $100 billion in real estate is positioned on land that geology has already reclaimed in principle. As the toe of these landslides is eroded by higher tides and stronger storm surges, the weight of the cliffs above becomes unsustainable. We are witnessing the beginning of a geographic restructuring of the country. What happens next in Sentinel Bay depends entirely on the next saturation event. If the 2026 autumn brings another series of atmospheric rivers, the 280 hectares currently sliding could expand to 400 or 500, pushing the boundary of the destruction into neighborhoods that today still believe they are on solid ground. The science is indifferent to the price of the real estate or the stories of the people living upon it. The geometry of the clay layer was set 250,000 years ago during the Pleistocene. The lubrication was provided by a changing climate, and the gravity is constant. As night falls over the Sentinel Bend, the silence is deceptive. Beneath the dark stands of Douglas fir and the darkened windows of abandoned estates, the earth is groaning. The tension in the remaining utility lines is humming at a pitch that suggests imminent failure. The roads are cracking, the clay is wet, and the Pacific is still waiting. In the end, the data is the only truth we have left. The land doesn't belong to us. We were merely occupying it during a long geological pause that has now come to an end.